I want to thank Dr. Paul Pillar for joining us from Washington, D.C. He is someone who has come to support not only our World Affairs Council, but others throughout the country with his expertise and knowledge. He's at Georgetown University. You're at D.C. right now, right?
Just outside Washington.
Okay. And so we'll get to hear about him. We did a program with Dr. Siavashi and Dr. Pillar during the pandemic, also about Iran, and that was about the nuclear deal that was up for discussion at the time. So I want to thank Dr. Pillar for giving us his time from his busy schedule. I also want to thank our host, Trinity University, and Dr. Susan Siavashi, who's a professor here, for making us feel welcome. And we also have some goodies in the back that Mahjan also brought, as well as Dr. Siavashi. So thank you, Trinity. Thank you, Dr. Siavashi, for hosting us. If we could give them a round of applause. Before I introduce your moderator, I also want to recognize our board chair for the World Affairs Council of San Antonio, Peggy Pace. And I thank all the Trinity students. I've met a few of you, and thank you all for joining. I know it's probably a good reason not to do schoolwork tonight, and but it actually is schoolwork, right? Related very intimately to what is happening around the world. So thank you to the students who are here, and you guys are always welcome to attend our programming. And also Texas Public Radio is in the house. Thank you. I forget where you are. But thanks for coming to cover this event. Appreciate that. Mahjan Pana is your moderator. She is an extraordinaire when it comes to not only the real estate market, but she is also very passionate about Iranian-U.S. relations and what has transpired, and also represents the Meher Foundation right here in San Antonio. And we have QR codes all over the place in the front. And on the signs that you see on the table and on the table as you are coming in. If you want to learn more about the World Affairs Council, if you want to become a member, if you want to make a gift, if you want to come to the next event, please scan, talk to me or Samantha, who's in the back. We'll also check you all in. We'd love to see you again. So I don't want to speak anymore and get to the meat of the program. And I'm going to turn it over to Mahjan Pana with the Meher Foundation.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Welcome to Women Life Freedom, Iran's protest movement. Thank you, Dr. Pillar. Thank you, Dr. Siavashi. We'll go ahead and get started. And as I pass the microphone to each of you, just before you begin, if you can give a little bit of background information and bio about yourself so that the audience knows where you come from and all of your achievements, I think that would be greatly appreciated. So I'm 44 years old, the exact age of the Iranian Islamic regime, unfortunately. I haven't been back to Iran in almost 30 years. I went back once at the age of 15. My family members, majority of them do not go back. My father has not been back in 40 years. In prepping for tonight, I was disturbed, to say the least, when reading statistics and articles about the lack of women's rights in Iran, death row statistics, executions, and of course, what is happening in the country today. I am anxious, as are many of us, to arrive at the future of this movement to see what happens next. And I would like to think that this is the beginning of the end of the oppression of the regime. We recently had a family reunion in Turkey with relatives who joined us from Iran. My aunt's favorite pastime was walking the streets of Istanbul without her hijab. And it was such a bittersweet moment for me to see that joy in her and to know that after 2 weeks, she would have to go back and wrap that scarf around her head. The current uprisings began after the death or the killing of a 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, who was from the Kurdistan province. She was detained by the morality police for not wearing the appropriate hijab or the covers, the head coverings in public. I'm going to pass it to Dr. Siavashi. If you can tell us more about what has sparked the movement, the characteristics, and the differences between this movement and what has happened in the past.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. I feel so little here. I can't see everybody, but that's, I guess, it's.
We can stand up and talk if you.
Oh, no, that's okay. I'll go on. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but can Dr.
Can you hear me, Dr. Pillar?
You need to use the microphone for me to hear you. I heard Ms. Panan just fine.
The only thing is that I don't want to put it too close to my mouth because it makes sort of a echo, and that is not good here either. So anyway, I'm Susan Siavashi. I'm a professor, political science department. I teach courses back in the US. I am from Iran, and I haven't been to Iran since 2003. So in fact, this is a good start. First of all, I'm gonna informally read my formal comments here. So for the sake of efficiency in time. But I also want to mention from the very beginning that what we know about what is going on in Iran is mostly through mediated, through social media. And that in itself, we have to be cognizant of it. I haven't been to Iran for a long, long time, so I don't have first-hand knowledge of what's going on. I read Iranian newspaper, state newspaper. I'm well versed in social media that comes from the diaspora and outside media. So I sort of have to gauge my way around and see what makes more sense to me. So some of my remarks is as I said, all my remarks are based on what I've read, not what I have witnessed. Let me start by saying that I'm not here to predict what's going to happen. My guess is as good as any. What I'm here for is to provide you with a context that allow us to have maybe a deeper understanding of this momentous period in Iran history. Mahsa Amini, as Mostan mentioned, was a 22-year-old woman who died while under detention by the morality police of Tehran. She was of Kurdish background. Her death sparked a protest movement that started in her birthplace of Saqqez, but like a wildfire spread all over the country in the following days and weeks. They still continue. There are a lot of people who have joined this movement. I'll speak to that a bit later when I talk about the characteristics of the movement. But the question that I think there are several questions that we need to address partially, briefly. One is, how do we understand the nature of this movement? What is its form? Who are its participants, and what do they want to achieve? Finally, there is a question of what are the achievements of the movement so far. So, for several reasons, when we think about the form of this movement, it's a unique movement. First of all, in the history of protest in the post-revolution Iran, this is a unique movement in its geographical spread, but most particularly in its temporal breadth. It's been going on. It's no movement has lasted so long with this kind of occurrences. One can talk about the movement in 2009 as when millions of people pour into the street of Tehran and Isfahan. But those are mostly really big urban movement. It didn't go into the smaller city that this one has. And another aspect in terms of form of it, which is both, how should I say it? It's both a positive strength for the movement, because it's very hard for the state, despite the killing, to basically put out the fire, so to speak. It's the sporadic nature of this. I mean, it's spontaneous. It goes from one place to another. There is no prediction about when and where the movement will start. Part of it is because actually it's a leaderless movement. There is no leader. There is no discernible organization. And these are, as I said, are spent in some ways because it's very difficult for a state to control it, and despite the killing that's going on. But at the same time, the question is that how can a movement succeed if the intention is to topple a regime and to create a new regime? So that requires, in my view, organizational infrastructure, leadership, planning, and there is really no planning that we can talk about, except for the desire for freedom, the desire to lead one's life in a normal way, like a normal person, to be able to go into the street without being fearful of harassment, and other things that I would like to speak about a little bit. What was I going to? I guess so this is one aspect that makes it unique, the form of it. But the other one is the participant of the movement. This is a movement of the youth, the Generation Z, who are savvy in how you call it, the social media. They're irreverent. They want their freedom. They want to enjoy life. They want to sort of fulfill their desires in some ways. But it became political. This kind of desires of normal life has become very much political. Another unique aspect of this movement is the overwhelming participation of women, young women, and who, in defiance of the state, are in the street en masse, taking off their headscarf, throwing them into bonfires, dancing. These women have been the leaders of this still leaderless movement, inspiring support from many, including some religious women, by the way, who also come to the street in support of the movement while wearing their hijab. They believe, these women, these other women, that hijab must be a choice, not a state decree. And that I'm creating a parenthesis. This movement should not be used by people who are Islamophobe in Paris or other places to say that hijab should be banned. This has to be a choice for everyone in terms of what to wear, how to wear. At least this is my opinion. Well, this show of support for women and what they were doing is the reason that some scholar argues that compulsory hijab is central to the authoritarian practices of the state, and that rejecting state control over women's body by first rejecting the implementation of compulsory hijab is both a preliminary and a central step towards demolishing the oppressive machinery of the state and reforming people. The central term, women, life, freedom, they argue, these scholars, is a testament of this movement as being predominantly, if not exclusively, a feminist movement or a revolution. There's no doubt that women have been central actors in the story of this movement, but there's also a great deal of energy emanated by others, from others, most importantly by ethnic minorities, with their own sets of grievances against the state. As I mentioned earlier, The first day of protest occurred in Kurdish city, the birthplace of Mahsa Amini. Since then, there has been more intense demonstration in Kurdish areas, but Kurdistan, in the western part of Iran, is not the only site of ethnic-related protests. In the east and southeast of Iran is Baluchistan, where Baluchis, the most impoverished of all ethnic minorities in Iran, live. It is actually in Zahedan, the provincial capital of Baluchistan, that the state used the most deadly attack. 7 or more people were killed a few weeks ago. So it's very important to reflect on the intersection of gender, ethnicity, and even class as we try to understand this movement. Women, life, freedom captures this intersectionality quite well. Do you want me to go on and talk about the differences, or should I stop here?
I think
along?
we can go back and forth a little bit at this point, and you've given a great background to what's going on in Iran today and for the past almost 7 weeks. I think I'd like to continue and ask Dr. Pillar to go into a little bit of context for us. So Iran has an extensive and ancient history, and in addition, a very complex relationship with the USA, from the coup d'etat of 1953 to the exile of the Shah, to the hostage crisis, and so forth. It's ironic to me that a country that was home to a human rights charter is home to a just king, Cyrus the Great, whose commemoration day is this Saturday, was also a place where women in ancient times were highly regarded and held influential positions, is now today a stage for a fight for not just women's rights, but human rights. Focusing more on modern day Iran, Dr. Pillar, if you can speak to the historical context of Iran since 1979 and give us a little bit of background on the USA's foreign policy on Iran today.
Well, thank you. First of all, we were asked to, give a bit of bio, and in my case, I don't have the personal connections with Iran that our other panelists do. I am a political scientist by training who had a 28-year detour as a career in the U.S. intelligence community. And my last position before I retired from government service was as the National Intelligence Officer for the Near East and South Asia, which basically involved supervising the coordination of analysis, political and economic analysis on those regions of the world that involved all of the component agencies of the intelligence community. And then after that, I had a shorter second career as a professor at Georgetown University. I might add, I had several years ago the pleasure of speaking to this World Affairs Council in person in San Antonio, but now I'm joining you remotely. Pertinent to the question that Ms. Panop posed, I think we can tie the question of Iran's status in the region in with the question of the current disturbances by looking back at the Iranian Revolution, 1978-79, and asking ourselves, how did that succeed in overthrowing the Shah's regime? And I think the big thing that forms a contrast with the current situation, as Dr. Sivashi described it, is in contrast to the lack of coherent leadership and organization and more of the spontaneity of what we're seeing today. Khomeini's revolution was very well organized, based on an infrastructure centered on the mosques and with the leadership provided by Khomeini himself. And the Shah basically made the mistake of not, taking this kind of organizational component seriously. So I think, with the $64 question in many people's minds today about, how far can this current protest movement go toward unsettling the current regime? I think that is a major, major factor. That the reason Khomeini's revolution succeeded, one of the reasons it succeeded some 4 decades ago, was it did have that organization and leadership, and was not just a spontaneous movement. Since then, although we still describe this as a revolutionary regime, and in some respects it is, and of course the whole issue of hijab and telling women what they have to wear and so on is an unmistakable indication of extreme autocracy. It really isn't, the regime isn't what it used to be in those first few years, in a way that is pertinent to foreign policy and its place in the region. There was some sentiment among the revolutionary leadership after Khomeini took power that they would have to instigate other revolutions elsewhere in the region in order for their own to survive, which was the kind of sentiment that some of the Russian Bolsheviks had when they had their revolution back in 1917. But after years went by and the Islamic Republic was still around, it was clear that that was not necessary. So Iran faces its main sort of predicament, if you will, for Iranian policymakers is that it is a ostracized, isolated regime that has been treated as a pariah for various reasons, its nuclear policy and other things, as well as its internal policies and violations of human rights. And in fact, it's been treated so much as a pariah and subjected to so much sanction that any additional sanction that is applied in response to what's taking place today with regard to the forceful suppression of protest is largely symbolic. I mean, our government, along with the European governments, are finding additional individuals and organizations to sanction, but it's not going to make a whole lot of practical difference. And then you look at other aspects of the regime's foreign and regional policies. It grows out of this sense of isolation and pariahdom, looking for partners and support wherever they can find it. And this really underlies the policies you see with regard to Iran's relations today with China, with which it is trying to develop a deeper economic relationship, given that it's subject to all the economic isolation and sanctions from the West, and also with Russia, which has taken the security dimension that I'm sure you've read about with regard to providing arms for the Russians, including these drones, as the Russians have depleted their own military stockpile. And this is against a background in which there has never been any love lost between Iran and its Persian predecessors and Russia and the Russian Empire. It's strictly a transactional relationship that involves such things as the Russian military needs and Iran's economic needs and needs for any kind of friend it can find. And then within the region, Iran faces a situation where it is a predominantly Persian state in a region that is overwhelmingly Arab. It is a predominantly Shia country in a region that is predominantly Sunni. And so it really has to try harder to try to win friends and influence people. And it's largely been in a reactive mode with regard to most of its regional policies. The big attitude forming experience for many of the current Iranian leaders was the terribly destructive Iran-Iraq war back in the 1980s, which was begun by Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. Iran, as well as Iraq itself, suffered enormously in terms of the casualties and the costs. And then in other places, you've got, for example, the war in Yemen, where it was the Saudi intervention that really escalated things into a humanitarian disaster. And the Iranians reacted to that, being happy to make their Saudi rivals bleed as long as the Saudis insisted on being there. And then there's Syria, where we've had this civil war going on since 2010. And Syria has always been the only really long-term and reasonably reliable Arab ally that Iran has had. And so it considers that relationship very important. And thus the Iranians, along with the Russians, have been principal outside support for the Assad regime in Syria. Now, all of the, and also I might add, those are kind of conflictual sorts of things, but we've had a desire and actual moves on the part of the Iranians to achieve some kind of démarche with the Saudis and at their other cross Gulf rivals particularly in talks that have gone on under the mediation of the Iraqi government. Now, all of these situations that I've just described are largely independent of the political and ideological coloration of the regime in Tehran. I mean, the basic facts about Iran's place in the region, its status as an ethnic and religious minority region-wide, its status in looking at itself as a major regional player, as one of the largest and most populous countries in the region. All of that would be true whether we still had the Shah in power, or we had a liberal democratic regime, or we had the Islamic Republic. I think, you know, how the current protests against the current regime relate to all these foreign policy questions it's in a limited sort of way. It's insofar as negative international reaction and even just symbolic sanctions loaded onto the ones that are already in place simply increase this sense of isolation that the regime has. I might just note one other thing before I yield the floor back that's in the foreign policy area that, of course, has been in the news over the last few months, and that concerns negotiations to try to reinstate the agreement that limited Iran's nuclear program. This was the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, which went into effect in 2015. And then, as you may recall, some 3 years later, after Donald Trump became president in 2018, he pulled the United States out, reneged on the US commitments. And since then, after the Iranians sort of observed a grace period for about a year, they have been escalating their nuclear activity with regard to Iranian uranium enrichment. We've had, over these last several years, one of the clearest instances you're ever going to have in terms of a choice between a couple of different policy options as far as US policy is concerned. And of course, there's continued debate in this country about that agreement and whether people are supportive or opposed to reinstating something like that. During the 3 years in which the agreement was in force, from 2015 to 2018, the Iranians, as certified by international inspectors, observed all the limitations, which were extremely strict limitations. They had to do away with almost all of their stockpile of enriched uranium, for example. They had to fill in a reactor with cement to make sure it couldn't produce nuclear fuel. And then since 2018, after Iran was released from its obligations because the US reneged on the agreement, we've had a much different situation. The so-called breakout time, if Iran were ever to try to decide to build a nuclear weapon, has been reduced from what was over a year when the JCPOA was in effect to now most experts estimate only a week or two. And on other fronts, Iranian behavior and what they represent to us in the United States certainly hasn't gotten any better. Some of the most aggressive regional actions occurred after 2018, such as a cruise missile and drone strike on Saudi oil facilities in 2019. And because of the overall discrediting of the relative pragmatists in the regime who negotiated the nuclear agreement, the hardliners are in control even more firmly than they were before in Tehran. All of this it really isn't a US policy issue at the moment, though, because the ball is really in the Iranians' court. A few weeks ago, the European Union put on the table a new draft agreement. Both the US and the Iranians reacted to it. And it's the Iranians who have not really taken that piece of paper off the table and carried it to completion. The regime has continued to make additional demands, the principal one being that they want the US somehow to guarantee that what happened with Trump in 2018 isn't going to happen again. Well, of course, no US administration can ever commit a future administration in that way, so it's simply constitutionally impossible. My own assessment is that there's been a lot more resistance inside the regime to re-entering the kind of agreement we had with the JCPOA, precisely because of what happened in 2018. There are a lot of voices within the regime that say, if we got only a couple of years of sanction relief, that's not going to be worth it if Joe Biden loses and we get Trump or another Republican back in the White House after the 2024 election. So it's not really a U.S. policy issue. Well, that's kind of the foreign policy and regional context. Let me stop there, and we can talk about other things.
Thank you so much. So I'll open this up to both of you. And, I mean, this is, as Dr. Siavashi said, it's an unprecedented movement. Last week, there were over 100,000 people that marched in Berlin. In Toronto, there were 50,000 people that marched. You're seeing so many artists speak up, concerts being put up, new songs being produced. We have the revival of the pre-revolution flag, the sun and lion flag that you're beginning to see everywhere. Just so many different things going on. And so I'm curious what you think, if this does turn into a full-fledged revolution, and I'll go back to Dr. Siavashi, and for the sake of time, and we can keep answers, Dr. Pillar and Dr. Siavashi, to maybe 1.5 to 2 minutes from this point on. What happens next? Do we go to martial law? Is there another coup d'etat? Do we have a democratic vote if this does turn into an actual revolution?
Actually, as I said in the very beginning, I can't predict. This is an evolving, very fluid, very sort of in the making movement. It can go anywhere. What I can say is some of the achievement of this movement, and that the fact that state-society relation cannot be as before, in particular in terms of women's rights. I mean, we can talk about the corruption of the regime, we can talk about the oppressive aspects of it, but there are elements of it that make the state and society somehow connected to each other, and the state cannot totally ignore some of the demands if it wants to survive. And there are still factions within the regime, so we have to keep that in mind. So what some of the achievements might be anecdotal, might be really trivial, it seems trivial, but I think they are lasting. And one of them, for example, is that the morality police, from what I've heard, is being disbanded. It's been disbanded. There are a lot of reports that women without their hijab, scarf, or even the manteau go into the street and walk by the police, and the police would look at them and nothing happens. The students, both men and women, have rejected the wall of separation between men and women in universities. So they just sit down and eat together. Now, what does that mean? I don't know how it will get anywhere. But I want to go back to what you said earlier about the diasporic community. And I would like to sort of provide a cautionary note there. First of all, I think the diasporic movement or groups are very disunited. They are fighting with each other. There are some monarchists, there are some those who wish for a democratic republic. There are some who are supporter of Mujahideen Khab, etc. And there have been clashes in many areas. Not all of them. I mean, not all these movements are clashing with each other. But what I don't think that this particular flood of support, which is very understandable, I and Iranian feel the same in so many ways. I'm not sure that this has a defining impact on what is going on in Iran. And that's why we need to spend time. But the way we can help Iran, I think, in fact, this is what I think, is that the particularly women in the West, the grassroots, young people like people who are here, can both learn from what is going on in Iran, because we all have our own problem in terms of state control over our body, not just state patriarchy, but societal patriarchy, the same way, not exactly the same way that happens in Iran, but there are parallels. So there is a need for, if you're interested in feminism, if you like, is there are possibilities of international feminist movement. And it is in this grassroots era that people can help each other. I totally agree with Dr. Keller. I don't think state by adding to sanction can get anywhere. I mean, Western state is just both symbolic and also it's been used very much by the state in terms of suppression of the movement. We're trying to suppress the movement and also delegitimizing the attempt. I'm not saying that they have succeeded, but delegitimizing the Iranian diaspora community. So we have to be careful about thinking and reflecting much more about how it is that we can help Iranian protest movement. I don't have an answer for you.
Sure. While we're on the topic, we had briefly spoken about Hamed Esmailian, who is one of the movement organizers outside of Iran. He lost his daughter in the plane crash of 2020, the Ukrainian plane crash. Talk about the interpersonal dynamics that are at play between the diaspora and within. I mean, there's obviously a connection, there's communication, there's an importance to it.
Oh, of course there is importance. You're Iranian, I'm Iranian, a lot of people who are here for Iranian, we have our own sentiments, our own proclivities. We are, most of us, I hope, I think, I don't know, we are pro-protest, pro-freedom. For me, in answer to your question, I think we are all inspired by what is going on in Iran. What I'm saying is that I don't know how much and in what way we can support the movement through the demonstration. I think that makes, I'm very sorry to say that makes us feel better. But I don't know exactly how it would translate into promoting the movement within Iran. Maybe it does, I don't know.
Thank you. Dr. Pilla, I want to come back to you. We spoke about the 79 revolution. I will, in my own opinion, say that there was a lot more Western involvement in Iran at that time, and even through the Iran-Iraq war. The media was at play, and this time around with this movement, I don't think the media really gave the coverage that Iran deserved to this movement until, well, maybe three, 4 weeks into this movement. Do you have any thoughts about that? And, was it just kind of a lazy thing, or was there something more at play?
I think it's just competition for headlines. And when it comes to developments overseas, the obvious big competitor is the Russian war in Ukraine. You look at how much newspaper space has been taken up by that. And then, that's something where there, a city is seized or a frontline moves, there's something to report on. With regard to the disturbances in Iran that have now been going on for about a month and a half, it doesn't, break down as readily into, new things that are happening that are different from what was happening last week or the week before. Occasionally, such as in the news today, we get reports of the confrontations that occurred, especially in the Kurdish provinces yesterday, because it was the 40th day, after the death of the young Kurdish woman that started all this. But there isn't a whole lot of that. So I think it's just simple competition for space in the news.
I know we're going a little bit over time here, and I want to open it up to Q&A. So we'll go through the next page that I have really quickly. I want to read some stats just for the audience if you're not too familiar with what is happening in Iran. And of course, these are estimates. I highly believe that the numbers are greater than what I am saying here. There's been reported 12,000 people that have been detained in the protests. 3,000 of them alone in Tehran. Over 250 people dead, including 32 children. In Baluchistan alone, on Friday prayer, as Dr. Sirovashi said, 82 people were killed, shot in the head. Since 2007, in Iran, 201 women have been executed. Under President Raisi, 24 women executed since August of 2021. This year alone, 400 people have been hanged, and these are just highlights. You have girls being raped before they are executed during custody. You have a pop artist who was arrested for singing a song. You have Elnaz Rekabi, who was arrested for competing in South Korea without her hijab. And both these individuals were arrested, let go, and forced to make statements. Both Ebrahim Raisi, the president of Iran, and Khamenei are accused of crimes against humanity. Their involvement in the mass executions of 1988 in Iran is apparent, where there are estimates between 5,000 to 30,000 people who have been executed in 1988. Yet Raisi was allowed onto the UN general stage just last month in September, amidst of the protests that have been going on. And I know we've talked about some of this already, but I'll open it back up to you again. If you do have any final highlights, Dr. Sirovashi or Dr. Pillar, you'd like to make on when does the international community really get involved? I know we've gotten a lot more support and involvement from public figures and governments and speakers, but if there's anything else you'd like to add on that note before we move on.
I personally think we should open it up to questions because
Great.
we sort of spoke to them.
Dr. Pillar?
Questions are fine with me.
Okay, so before I open it up, let me give you another highlight. Iran's population is 88 million, 86% literacy rate. The median age is 32 years old. As Dr. Sirovashi said, Generation Z is leading this movement. Women's rights are limited. The police and military guard are using live ammunition, tear gas, water cannons, and force against their own citizens. Hijab has been compulsory since 1981. The poverty rate for the country since 2019 is 18%. And women cannot leave the country without the permission of their father or husband, and at most times are valued significantly less than the men are. At this time, I will open it up for discussion and questions. I see one hand raised in the back, so if you have more questions, just keep your hand up and we'll get to you.
Go ahead.
Hello, hi, thank you so much. My name is Lola. Thank you so much for that insightful introduction that we got. I wanted to get your opinion and expertise on several things based on some of the things that you articulated. One is sort of alternative narratives and topics of discourse that are discussed, namely in what makes a successful revolution. First of all, there's been a lot of discussion in smaller sort of circles amongst Iranians about the fact that the reason this has been so successful is because it has precisely been a leaderless movement. So it kind of ties into my next topic that I think to get your opinion on is you mentioned this is a movement that's predominantly led by Gen Z, and you mentioned yourself that it is something that is by a generation who wants their freedom, who wants to have fun. Many would argue that the actual bigger factor is that they have no future. They've got nothing to lose. And this is why Gen Z is free. So I feel like something like that adds a lot more weight to a generation who's young on social media, wants to have fun. But again, I've heard many, and of course, this is a biased point of view, is because they have zero future. In a population that is predominantly under the age of 30, they've got nothing to lose. And that's why they're standing there in front of the list. But I'd like for you to comment on that.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much.
One last thing for Dr. Pillar. If there is time, I'd love for you to articulate on how we can help Iranians resolve the inner conflict of whether supporting a nuclear deal legitimizes an organization and a sort of regime that, in their eyes, is not legitimate. At the same time, the call for going through with such a thing because of the dangers of a nuclear possibility. So how do we help Iranians rectify? Because as you know, a lot of the diaspora community are calling for the nuclear deal to completely be abandoned. which, from many points of view, from politics, economy, et cetera. I'm not an expert on that, but I'm sure you're aware of that, and I'd love your feedback on how we can help Iranians resolve this sort of tug of war about whether to support the nuclear deal or not, and what that means for the UK. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your remark. I totally agree with you. It's not just fun that people want, but that is part of it. What I wanted to say is that people would like to have a normal life. And I'm talking about the Generation Z, and particularly the middle class part of this. But I also mentioned that the regime is corrupt. It is not capable. It hasn't been capable to solve the problems of the population in terms of economic, in terms of politics, etc. And some of it, to some extent, I would say also is related to the sanctions, which I think is a double-edged sword, because it's the people who really ultimately suffer from this. Whether that suffering, as some people would like, would lead to the demolishment or demolishing or collapse of the regime, I think we don't know. It's a wish that many have. I don't happen to subscribe to that idea. I talked about the impoverishment of the ethnic groups, the economic impoverishment, the oppression that they. So I don't think that just having fun is what I meant to say. If I had given that, given that impression, I apologize for it. And I absolutely agree with many things that you mentioned in terms of wanting to have actually some freedom to lead a normal life. That's what I was trying to say. But the normal life also includes economic life, or sustainable life, which many people are denied as a result of multiple reasons, both the regime capability, capacities, corruption, etc. But some of it is also related to the regional development.
Thank you. Was part of your question for Dr. Pillar Golada, or Dr. Pillar? The nuclear deal.
Briefly, everything that any of us don't like about this Iranian regime, including the awful violations of human rights and the oppression that we've been talking about, all of that is occurring under the so-called maximum pressure policy that was established under the Trump administration, and which has been continued by the Biden administration. That is to say, we haven't had a nuclear agreement. If that continues to be the case, then all of those other problems involving Iran, all of the awful stuff we've just been talking about during the past hour, we would still have, and we'd have a nuclear crisis on top of that. The JCPOA placed restrictions on Iran, preventing it from doing things that other sovereign states are free to do with regard to nuclear activity. It doesn't legitimate anything, it actually restricted the regime.
Quick comment on the nuclear. Iran, to its north, has Pakistan, who has atomic weapons. To the south, it has Israel with atomic weapons. So I can see them being a little worried about the atomic weapons in the area, but mostly about the change of regime. As a historian, Iran's government's changes since 41 were always an impetus from the outside. The British did it in 41 when Mossadegh was elected president. Kermit Roosevelt and the MI6 made short work with him. The Shah, as you rightly observed before, there was an organization behind one particular person. So the opposition had one particular person to focus on. And as you remember, or some of you may not remember, cassette tapes were constantly being smuggled into Iran. And so a lot of propaganda came that way. That's how the Shah was. The Shah is not, or the present government is not going to be removed until there is a unified, I hate to say leader, outside of Iran that people can focus on. Of course, as in most countries, the key element is the military. We don't know what the military may or may not be.
And look, you asked a question about whether this is a revolution, and I want to connect that to what Robert was asking here. I agree with you that leadership, I don't mean leader, but leadership has to exist. Some sort of organization that can provide planning program to for the after fact in particular, but not just the after fact, meaning the regime collapse. We unfortunately in Iran, what we saw during the 1979 revolution was we had the negative. Shah bayad bere, Shah bayad bere. The Shah has to go. But what next? So there were lots of different groups of people that never really connected to each other in terms of what should happen. And Khomeini has the will to power as well as the organization. So that group of religious clergy who happened to be radical and conservative in some ways, altogether, took the power and concentrated the power in their own hand. Now, whether this movement can become a revolution, as you asked, I think it depends on many factors that both Dr. Pillar and I think we spoke to. One thing that you mentioned, and it's the nature of the regime. You're right that at the top of the regime, previous regime, there was one person, and here we have Khamenei, but there are different factions underneath, under him, in a sense. What makes this, if it becomes a revolution, it is revolutionary in some ways, in terms of feminism, in terms of the demand. You hear the chant of death to dictator, and etc. But that doesn't make, it's a revolutionary episode, but it's not a revolutionary situation. The revolutionary situation, when you see cracks within the regime, when you see part of the army to join the revolutionaries, and we don't yet see evidence of that. And that is, I think, the problem. However, going back to the previous remark, the leaderlessness of the movement, it is in some ways a strength, but not if it would like to become a revolutionary as such.
We have a question on Zoom from Ms. Escalante. I think I could answer this one, but if one of you could pick this up. She's asking about the different religious groups in Iran. What are some of the other minority religious groups in Iran?
I can answer that, but Dr. Pillar, would you like to?
Please. Go ahead.
Of course, almost 99%, well, not 99%, but 90-some% of Iranian are Muslim. 90% of Iranian are Shia Muslim. About 8% or so are Sunni Muslim. And then you have 1.5% Christian. You still have some Jews. Some of them have immigrated to Israel. And there are also smaller group of connected to Islam. You have Yazidis, you have Ali Allahi, and some others. But the overwhelming majority of Iranian are Muslim, of the two sects. The biggest sect is, of course, Shiism, which is about 90% of Iran.
Thank you. Other questions? Hands? Yes, sir.
This is directed to Dr. Pilar. I was just wondering, what do you think it would take? I know with the Russian-Ukraine war, maybe the U.S. and other Western countries wouldn't get involved, but would there be something to prompt this revolutionary episode, like you said, when it becomes a situation that the US would get involved?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear it. Ms. Panat, could you repeat the question?
He was asking, what would it take basically to get the US involved?
To get the US involved?
Yeah,
Well, I think, Dr. Siavashi covered most of the main points we have to remember when it comes to the question of external involvement. I would just add the caution that there's always a potential negative side for more visible involvement, because that plays into the regime's accusations that is foreigners, the likes of Americans and Israelis, that are stirring up the internal dissent, and that it is not so much a matter of discontented Iranians. So you have to be very careful that you're not being a negative influence on for the people you're trying to help. I don't have any particular U.S. policy silver bullet on this. Different from what the current administration has been doing. You have the denunciations, you have the sanctions on individuals and groups, which, as we mentioned before, are largely symbolic. Beyond that, I wish I had better ideas.
I think that the Western involvement in Iran is almost, for me, a love-hate relationship. There's been involvement in the past, as many of us have said, and we know. And I almost think we're waiting for that knight in shining armor to come in and topple the government, and hunky dory, everything's great again. I think that's kind of what some of us are thinking, is that why is the U.S. waiting? Like, isn't there something more that they can do, quicker action to just get rid of the government, put in a democratic government, and let's move on the way, which unfortunately isn't going to be the case this time around.
Very much. Many Iranians believe that U.S. involved in the downfall of Shah, and many believe that U.S. take advantage of the Congress as well to reach a balance in the area, to sell the arms to the Arab countries, and also justify the Iranian Israel as well. So,
Well, I'm sorry. Again, I had trouble hearing.
Can you hear me? Dr. Phil, do you hear me?
I can hear you, but just it's very echoic. The person whose audio I hear the best is Ms. Banaz.
If you want to walk over this way,
Oh,
get closer to me now.
All right.
Probably right about there. There you go.
Let me just be closer then.
There you go.
All right, good evening. So many Iranians believe, and I think when you look at the documents released also by the West, by UK, US, that US was directly involved in the downfall of Shah. There are many details, if you want, we can discuss about it. And as well, take advantage of the presence of mullahs in power in Iran to reach a balance in the region by, for many various reasons. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm not sure what it refers to when you talk about the United States being involved in the fall of the Shah. I mean, there have been all kinds of recriminations, of course, as to what the policy back during the Carter administration was at the time of the revolution, and whether the threat to the Shah's rule was taken seriously enough, or we recognized early enough what the power of Khomeini's movement was. But in terms of what the U.S. government was seeking, it certainly was to keep the Shah in power, and it was to continue to look on him as a major security and economic partner in that part of the world. So if there's involvement by the U.S., it was only sins of omission and policy that didn't work, as opposed to a desire to see him go.
Well, when the student took over the U.S. embassy in Tehran, they found some documents that indicates the group of mullahs head by Beheshti had many meetings with Sullivan in the embassy, also in Germany. The students were surprised. They took these documents to Khomeini, and he apparently ordered them to not release those documents. There are, Heiser also was ordered to go to Iran, and Shah was not informed of the Heiser's presence in Iran just months before the revolution. And his mission was to ensure the generals not going to do anything against the revolutionary, the people who were on the street. Are you aware of that?
I think the balance of historical evidence supports the traditional criticism that of the U.S. at that time. Not that it wanted to see the Shah go, but that when it comes to things like meetings with the likes of Beheshti, that there weren't enough meetings. There wasn't enough collection of information about what the clerical opposition was up to. And it was, in retrospect, it became defined as a big intelligence failure. I think that the weight of the evidence is still in that direction. Yeah, certainly there were, American officials as well as others outside the government who didn't have any particular love for the Shah in the sense that they realized he was an autocrat, he was an oppressor of human rights in many ways, but that did not translate to becoming a supporter of Khomeini's revolution.
All right. I think we're going to stop there, but before we end, I wanted Mojan to share a little bit of the Mayor Foundation, which is the local cultural Persian Culture Society. They just had a Persian festival, which we were a part of, and any call to action by anyone here of what people could do here in order to voice their concerns or take some sort of action.
Again, my name is Morgan. I'm the co-founder and city president of Mayor Foundation and the San Antonio Persian Cultural Society. We are a non-profit, non-religious, non-political organization. So I do have to disclose that anything that I said, my political views and thoughts are in no way or shape or form a reflection of the organization but my own. Thank you for having us here today, Armin. There is a huge banner outside with a QR code. If you scan that, that will take you to our website. You can join our mailing list. We do have, as far as call to action goes, we do have a candle vigil tomorrow in front of Baklava Bakery, who graciously gave us the delicious cookies in the back today. Off of Wurzbach and I-10 tomorrow at 7 p.m. It will be a peaceful gathering in remembrance of the innocent lives that have been lost. Again, that's tomorrow, 7 p.m., Baklava Bakery parking lot. Saturday, there is not our organization, but there is a protest at Main Plaza, downtown San Antonio at 3:30 p.m. if anyone would like to join in for that. There's so much to cover, and I don't want anyone to feel that any part of this discussion or anyone whose life has been lost is not important enough for us to mention them. We just don't have time because this is such a complex discussion. I've read so many articles and stats and so forth during the past week. Amnesty.org, change.org. Amnesty does an annual report, which is very insightful if you'd like to learn a little bit more about Iran. There's other websites as well, hrw.org, fidh.org, but thank you for being here. I appreciate it. This is a very important topic, very dear to my heart, but very important for the world in general. It is a women's movement and it is about human rights. So again, thank you for being here. And should I pass it on to the panelists? We have a few minutes for closing remarks.
No.
Dr. Pillar, Dr. Siavashi.
Thank you.
Let's leave your last remarks as the last word. I have nothing else to add.
Always.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. This is being recorded, so if you've registered with your email, we'll send you a recording. And Dr. Pillar, thank you again for joining us, not only from your years of experience with
with the Central Intelligence Agency, but also with, we came to you through the Iran project. So thank you for that. Dr. Siavashi, thank you so much for hosting. Kate Manuel.